Firstly, I wanted to say thank you for hanging in there. I really appreciate it that I'm not talking to three, but three would have been just as nice. The first thing I should do is introduce myself. I'm from a faculty of design, but I also need to acknowledge that I'm a guest here. Thanks to Sarah, who's sort of let me experiment with some crazy ideas. She's been a fantastic supporter and assisting me, working with me in examining the messy, organic, qualitative data. And that is dealing with you, with dealing with people, with dealing with the visitors in these spaces. And this presentation really has two components. And the first is the problem of acknowledging experience in the museum. And the second is the analysis of the value of these experiences, and in this context with respect to visualization environments. As museums wrestle with the tension of mission and market, those who contribute to public institutions need to understand that delivering experiences cannot be taken as just one more activity in their repertoire. Museums are required to consider new standards calibrated to the evaluation of experiences rather than just of things. And so, what is the consequence here of the shift from an ontological to a phenomenological value? If we include experience in the museum, then we need to look at its value as equally, thoroughly and differently as we have artefacts. And I think we need to examine how experience is disseminated both in museums and elsewhere. And we need to know how certain experiences are valorised over others. And according to what standards. And Hein, she always is in the back of my head going, and that's one of the aspects. And then, of course, visualization environments, we know they provide new and unknown contingencies for exhibition production and being in technologised space. And if we know that, we want to know what do visitors in these spaces think and feel, and what is the structure of that experience. And how can we find engaging, human-centred design, novel ways to ascertain, engage and visualise these experiences? So this is the wrap, for about what visualisation systems are, and I'm not going to go into them other than to say you've been in them all the last couple of days. Here's one classic, iconic example. But this assessment of the museum's service would appreciate the integration of experience in museums while also addressing their new elected experiential function. And again, Hein reminds me. Now, assessment, has a long history, and visitor research has a long history. If we think about the, Robertson's 1928 tracking methods through to today's autopoiesis, narration, SWOT analysis, this sort of thing. We know that today that the visitor, once a passive receiver of a curatorial authority, today is an active agent in the construction and determination of meaning. And here, agents also, I mean, in terms of co-authors, curators, all of the stakeholders, they are also active. And you can see that in the way in which people are animating aspects. They're taking small elements that they think is important in an animation or in a certain visualization. But within this position, also with audiences, we know that what counts as knowledge is always contextually dependent. But the museum, it wrestles with the tensions between mission and market, and this position, as Judith Mastow's point, is that we all, as curators, there is this intention, but at the same time, the museum competes today in an experience economy, deals with experiential consumption and customer perception. And if you think about some examples, when you look at brandscaping, you look at the third space in another way that was mentioned today. If you look at Starbucks and retail environments, they deal with the experiential consumption and experience economy that the museum also has to compete with, where people go. And so A failure to deliver appropriate experiences and benefits to visitors in terms of understanding, anticipating and satisfying pertinent visitor needs and wants may lead to commercial failure in the increasingly competitive market. And this tension I'm finding quite common in the visitor research literature, but also when you look at curatorial programs. But if we look at a common aspect, which is branding and designing an experience, is a more common practice, and for someone who deals with design strategy and design thinking, experience design is a whole other area that I argue is problematic, because I think it assumes we can design and therefore control an experience. And to understand the value of an experience requires us to reframe and consider what is to design for. And I guess this is where I started to take the question further. And I think it helps us further the quest in the valorization of experience. But what we've also found is that in evaluation processes, I was thinking about Bob Stake's comment, is that when the cook tastes the soup, that's formative. When the guest tastes the soup, that's summative. And it's this disconnect, this stuff that I found with interaction design and product design, and also interior design, but particularly with Norman and Ortagni's work, is that they present the disconnect here between the cooking and the tasting. And there is a disjuncture here by what is intended by the designer and whether or not the visitor or the user applies or even gets the intention of the designer in the first place. But it's the other side, it was the flip side that I thought was exciting, and which is, if we look at intrinsic motivation, you know, why do people spontaneously do what they do not have to do? And there were clues about this in the studies that Sarah and I started with in 2006 about, you know, if you think about what intrinsic motivation actually is, it's a non-utilitarian, self-rewarding investment of energy into a subject, which causes one to hold the course in the absence of extrinsic rewards and even under stressful conditions. And I thought, man, this is perfect, because, you know, I observe these parallel experiences day after day in the wonderful laboratory. I have to thank Tim Hart for that. He's given me the Museum Victoria, where I have spent many, many, many days amongst many years stalking quietly under the guise of ethnographic observation of people. That in these spaces, they spend unusual lengths of time, they behave in new ways, in dark, hot, crowded environments, and at times wrestling with a single interface. And this motivation was fascinating. So in configuring this, I argue that we need to look at the structure of experiences, thoughts, perceptions and feelings. And this is a big, dirty question, because theorists and new media writers, you know, they've done this. Phenomenologists have looked at it, and I ask myself and other critics, well, why go over old ground? You know, we already know what's written about the photograph, the panorama, the cyclotron, the fresco. But the studies that we did show that there were new things to look at. There were new behaviours, and there were new thoughts and new feelings. And there were new challenges here. There were new ways of being in the space. There are new challenges in terms of the brain-body negotiation, and particularly the proprioceptive understanding in these spaces. Yes. But the easy part is the analytics. You know, as many times I've been in marketing projects where we look at analytics, we know what people do. We know where they go, we know how long they stand, we know how they track, we know whether they're a snake or a spider or a butterfly, but we know less about what they think and feel and bring to these spaces. But here's the rub. As feelings and experience are abstract and inaccessible to objective scrutiny, it's difficult to describe the exactness of an experience. I mean, you know, Aitken notes the limitation of use of language for the measurement of feelings. And, you know, we've tried and I've tried, and, you know, the semantic differential, I'm sure, is here to stay with various degrees of success. But this is problematic. But, you know, we know that experiences are multifactorial. They span physical and psychological responses that impact aesthetics, embodiment, and emotions, knowledge, learning, meaning-making, participation, and performance. So, what impact do these diverse new forms of visitor participation have on those creating content? Curators, stakeholders, users, visitors, participants, co-creators, whatever term you want to use, and delivering programs within these new technologised spaces. But the findings that we found so far, I think, assist stakeholders, developers, and designers of these systems. We spend a lot of money on creating content. We do a lot of producing, of putting out. But I think we also need to consider what happens when we're in. So we need to acknowledge these complex, abstract elements in these environments. So there are three major interesting factors, I believe, that contribute to this larger problem context. So what are the new conditions for these spaces? What is being in technologised space about? And what is the structure of these experiences? Just some comments that we found from people. So given the challenges of retelling and subjectivities, I cross multiple intersecting disciplines to include design, phenomenology, new media thinking, and neuroscience, underscored by museum visitor research. Because that museum visitor research really sets the foundation for me to be able to traipse around, I feel, and make these intersections more valid. The neuroscience part, which we'll go into in a minute, helps not only validate our bodily aspect, but also reflect back on the phenomenological discussion. So, you know, Arnaud's concept, I am the space where I am. You know, as philosophers have continued to wrestle with the hard problem of consciousness within the framework of the Cartesian mind-body dualism, and as psychologists and cognitive scientists have begun to exploit new experimental techniques and technologies, and as a computer scientist have struggled with real-world limitations of combining artificial intelligence and robotics, new appreciation has emerged. Well, it's not that new, but, you know, across a broad range of fields, they all agree that, you know, human beings are embodied creatures. And the following points that I bring out, not all of them, I haven't got enough time, but they're clues that frame and underpin the research concerning the structure of experience and the messy business that it really is. So thinking, it's an embodied act. Meanings and inferential patterns depend on schemata derived from our bodily experience. And this work of Mark Johnson and George Lakoff, you know, they've looked at, they trace figures of speech back to the structures of bodily experience. I found very interesting. I think we all know this. We extend our thinking to cognitive scaffolding. We've done it with books, but we do it now with the adoption of devices to extend on the cognitive realm of the self. The organism, I think of, we think of Chilean neuroscientist Francisco Varela's work on the embodied mind from '91. You know, he talks about how the organism registers sensory stimulation as a cycle of action and reaction. And if we didn't do it, we wouldn't be around. It's a fundamental biological characteristic. And that thinking is placeless and relational. We need to be able, perceiving meaningless images and shapes and forms detached from their context would not have given us an advantage. We'd still be floating around in some amoebic soup. No flight, no fight, no nothing. So, and vision also, this is another very interesting one, which Mark Hansen, in supporting Johnson's aim to put the body back in the discussion around visualisation systems, we know that the primacy of effective and interoceptive sensory processes generate haptic spatiality internally before we configure the external geometric space. And time as an endogenous bodily framing process, you know, I found this fascinating, that neurons work as dynamic self-organizing patterns rather than, you know, sequential arrangements. As I don't know, I thought it was working like software. And at the deepest level, the relation interrogation of these components, neurons firing in certain ways, give rise to temporality. And now, and when I was looking at Dewey's concept of experience, you know, before, during, after, and the structuring of experience and anticipation and the concept of point 3 of a now, you know, I found fascinating, and I could see that when its relationship to the way in which people dealt with being in visualization systems. Time from a neuroscientific perspective is not a steady string of temporal quanta, but rather horizon of integration. And here, Varela also talks about how affect provides the bond, the glue between temporal flow and perceptual event. So we make sense through concepts. It's not something that if we only had the right lens or the right bit of software, you know, we can scan the brain down to the right last pixel and we can tell when something fires off or when we love something or hate something or in pain. But it's not a perfect science. So we make use of patterns that we obtain in our physical experience to organise our more abstract understanding. And these properties inform the design and interaction scheme for interface, narrative and related design research methods that I've applied over the couple of years. So this melange is the stuff that I'm keep configuring and figuring. So if our embodied experiences rely on these schemes and they help us locate, learn and filter our words and concepts, and the body is the major filter, what does this mean for visualization spaces and how can we unpack the structures of meaning? So what are these experiences in the space? The patterns that we looked for, which over a couple of years, which I've done in various methods, as I explained, the qualitative aspects, we tracked people, we asked them questions. So I used some software to try and come to some quanta, and we came out with certain themes. And these are the themes, that there's the orientation, navigation, negotiation, time in the space is spatio-temporal. In images in the digital containers are like living systems that the visitor can influence with their own behaviour, and that changes their sense of time. I'm just going to give only a few comments on each because there's a lot of work on all of them. There, of course, the deceptions of the brain, the bidirectional or interactive relations between the viewer, screen and space in visualization systems already involves significant cognitive manipulation and dislocation of spatial parameters. If you ever are in the T-Visionarium and you realise that the one set of aggregate is in front of you and you then turn around and go, oh my God, the exact opposite is around. And people do this kind of bodily movement, they're dodging, they're swinging. It's a whole other ball game, which I find fascinating. The effect of the visitor and the screen content. I was thinking about how the hell, I mean, Lewis gets it, but how can we configure so much dense material? And we do it in many ways, but I'm wondering about the long-term, also the long-term effects of dealing with so much content. The interface usability and affects participation and orientation. Sound, volume, flow of content, conception of time, whether or not one user is using one screen, whether or not people are happy to share, or whether or not people are happy to wait. Some people enjoy the projection and being swept up in the images. Others recoil and actually interferes with their experience. So these aspects I found very interesting, also in terms of their orientation to the space. And of course, immersion, a sense of presence, level of being there. I mean, many times the responses were, you know, oh, I forgot where I was, oh, I couldn't believe I was here, I was disoriented. The reality world merging with the image world, and the visitor serving as the interface between them is also a very other very interesting proposition. And of course, the smaller experiences within the larger experiences, when you speak to people and you unpack this, it's a very interesting set of, I guess, contingencies for being in this space. And of course, flow, famous Csikszentmihalyi's concept, and it happens in these spaces. The emotional involvement in the activity that becomes so absorbing. People no longer consciously divide themselves from what they are doing, and you can see it when they leave the space too, that they are behaving, that the reflection and the recounting. They don't realise. 70% of the people that we interviewed in the exhibition at the Melbourne Museum, they had no idea that they'd spent longer than 19 to 30 minutes in the space at some point. And of course, the most interesting one that Sarah and I have been looking at is, of course, the social experience, the individual and co-experience, the way in which people and these diagrams reflect that, the way in which some people are happy to perform and others are happy to watch. Some people really enjoy watching others perform. Some people who never normally speak to each other really enjoy being the leader and assisting others in using the interface. These ways of social experience are very different to the traditional modes of operating in a museum. So the digital and aesthetic assets of exhibits deliver unique dramaturgies of virtual embodiment, immersion, co-presence, spectacle, and social collective performance to museum practice. But the assumptions designers make in developing behavioural and at times emotional affordance to things, services and systems is something that I think that I've been looking at in trying to use tools or build tools other than the more traditional ones and to configure how you can get some more realistic and immediate information. And we've done this through small groups, through social situations, but ideally in situ. And some of you have had the pleasure or the discomfort of using one of the apps that we're looking at to just get a little bit of information out of your life world at that time. And they're the group of activities that essentially deal with, these are the sorts of methods. One of them that I've looked at is unobtrusive observation of emotion, looking at interaction and introspection engagement through key states of human behaviour and activity, through the wristband, measuring temperature, measuring excitement, anxiousness, pain. But, you know, ethically it's a real problem with any museum to get this sort of stuff on. And B, it's a passive activity that I don't think works at this point. And there are real problematic factors in deriving emotional state from physiology yet. I don't think that the jury's out on that one. The other one is observing facial expression. We did lots and lots of time lapse. You can make, you can get ideas about complex mental states, but again, it's passive. And I find it problematic that people are being treated more like a research experiment rather than being involved in the co-authorship and having something to say and participating in the space. So we looked at digital devices, social media, handheld media, and of course social media, the work that Linda Kelly has done on that. I mean, it happens all the time. People come in with their extended cognitive devices, they tweet, they flicker, they send each other stuff, they photograph. That's all happening. What in terms of finding out the more sort of finer details, I guess, of experience in the space, they motivate users to try new activities, but they also change the way in which people deal in the space and work in the space, and that may not be a problem, but they also detract from the social aspects of the visit as well as interfering with the exhibit play. So there's a split between looking down at the interface and the space and the cognitive demand on dense design content, and I'm a big provider of dense design content, and most designers are. They want their thing to take primacy, their thing to be the most interesting, and that's just a common experience. So really in this process, the designer as a broker really has to be a facilitator and invisible. Two examples of too much dense material is the coda and the field. This is one of the first works we did where we looked at just asking people where they felt audio and video on the body and spatial sensation. And the second one, which is the one that I had to sadly let go because it was just too interesting and we never got any response about the space, was that every one of these flowers refers to a person's response, and each petal has to do with the level of response and the types, the themes of questions. And these flowers move slightly slowly, and night changed to day, and it was completely interactive. But it didn't work, and it has no place in uncovering people's responses to the space, because it is about the space, it's not about this tool. So the other one is we're looking at, and this is a common workshop that we do, is a co-creation of questions, and this is quite successful. We get people to write a love-hate letter to the space, and we also, the other one that we're looking at is storing thoughts through the tree metaphor. Contextual inquiry is a quite common design research practice. You get a little pack, glue, scissors, paper, and you build your own narrative of that. So the last one, the I Show You, which I've subjected some of you to, is trying to get introspection through engagement. And ultimately, you keep commenting and you keep changing it, and we keep getting more answers. These are early versions of that. Here you get to show how stimulated you are in the space, level of comfort, which is one we've kept. So these image schemes inform the semiotics and interaction used to ascertain the experience. I put these two in because I thought, well, if anyone who isn't involved in design at all understands how image schemes are so powerful, this is a favourite of my students, is the taxonomy of rap names. And this isn't done by any great computer software, it's just done by the labour of love of configuring data through ye olde interface design. We looked at different forms of design. And the best part is that visitors in the spaces reveal their own responses in relation to others, and this is where we're going to next. This is one example of a project that we did, as same with word games. People were more interested in each other's than their own. So ultimately the end goal here is to visualize a pulse. That once we have the data, I would like to be able to, so you can all be part of visualizing a pulse, and a very simple one where you get to understand people's feelings and thoughts about the space, but also be able to show and share, but also take in a deep segmentation if you want to about the data. So you just basically go through a cloud or a server, and ultimately at the end the data as a series of visuals is the game. So here we have a pond concept where the red is not much love and the green is lots of love, and you can actually click on the red and go into the actual specifics of the data. And we did a trial at the Heidi Museum of Modern Art, and again we have to be careful about the competition between the information design and the data and what actually is displayed in the space. So it's a series of evolving interactions. People, visitors, users, they're the real problem. New technologies, always changing, and the platforms in which they're in. So I remember Gillian Crampton Smith saying that those that develop and apply digital platforms barely understand the consequences of mediation in terms of their respective disciplines, much less the implications for any new synthesis in design. And I think we've moved we've moved on from that. We've made great leaps. And even if I go back to Hein's point that she asks museums to analyse the value of their experiences in their repertoire, the question of what it is to be in a digitally technologically augmented space is fundamental to the role of museum spaces in anchoring the whole museum experience, irrespective of whatever your curatorial aim is, I believe. And that's it. Thank you.
Tim, you want to come up and we'll just see if we have questions for either Tim or Anita.
Sarah.
Anita, based on the various evaluations that you have done, what revisions, additions have you made to Museum Victoria?
I think, well, Tim was talking about collaborations. I think it's an ongoing process. If they have a visitor research area and we share information, but my study is specifically to do at this point with the visualization systems and the RV setup there. It's always really positive, so at this point there haven't been any dramatic answers, but I think the biggest one is with the circles on the ground. That was a really important tell particularly for children. And because people didn't really know where to go, but maybe Tim can speak about that more.
Oh, yeah.
No, oh well.
I mean, the interactivity in that system was extremely experimental, and I don't think it really works, particularly. I think the connection between. You think it does? That's great. Good. But
and the people do too, and the kids do. I think the children. And that's a whole other area that is the next part that I'm hoping to look at, is that actually teenagers want to break it. If they can't break it and they can't play with it and they don't get that first one-trick pony thing happening, they're out of there. But the younger, like 11 down, I've observed that they love it and they are always helping others. They really enjoy the performance. But there were issues to do with it. These places are predominantly dark, hot spaces, and you know, people are grappling for their own sense of space, and I think those circles provided a fantastic opportunity for the children.
For lots of people, yeah, it's their first 3D experience like that, and yeah, it's unsettling for a lot of people. Yeah.
Another question? Yes, please.
I just wanted to ask Tim, why didn't you elaborate on why
Why don't you use the mic?
Oh, right. Just that you were talking before Anita talked about this specific installation, and you seem to have rather divergent kind of opinions about the success of the interactivity. And I just wanted you to elaborate on what you started to say.
The thing for me is that I think a lot of people don't realise that there is interactivity, and I think it just passes them by. Whereas I think kids are more cued to actually, for the light to change and come on and off, I think is more of a cue for them than it is for the adults. But even when you do that, it's quite slow sometimes to actually, you don't get enough gratification quickly enough, would be how I would describe it. So I'd be one of those people who, I'm out of there.
Yeah, but you're old.
Oh, no. Thank you.
Older.
I think we'll, oh, sorry. Okay, one last question.
In your presentation, you mentioned that when you arrived,
Oh, don't hurt yourself. Wait. Slow down. Pity the poor intern here.
At the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned that when you arrived, everything was on paper and all the information was on paper. And then afterward in your presentation, you also said that you capture about 20% of what happens throughout the museum. Do you have like an integrated information management system in place or something like that, so that you're able to collect everything that happens?
We certainly do, and I think you misunderstood. I mean, what I'm talking about with the 20% is capturing within an exhibition development process. So we've probably digitised maybe 60% of what we want to with the collection, and that's probably about 2 million items of the 17 million. because it's predominantly natural history, there's no need with the taxonomy system to actually digitise everything. So we'll never do that, I don't think.